Good evening and welcome to the dedication of the Duncan Public History Series in memory of Farris A. Duncan. Tonight's program will be the Stained Glass Windows, a Lost Art Reborn. My name is Marty Cheddar. I'm the local history librarian, and which I have the privilege to serve. 4 years ago, our library started several ambitious public history programs to document, we're using original research to document local history, culture, people, and life experiences. Two notable ongoing projects are Wayne County Baseball History and then Harvesting Our History, Wayne County Agriculture, which is in partnership with the Cooperative Extension. Last year we presented an engaging, was very successful program that documented the institutional memory of the Dewey Brothers Foundry, and later this fall we will feature the Borden Cotton Mill. Next, I welcome Mary Bartlett to make a few remarks.
Good evening. What a nice crowd this evening. Where's Glenn at? I hope you have this many people on Sunday at 11. As chair of the Wayne County Public Library Foundation Board, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. Much thought went into planning this evening, and the Foundation Board is grateful for Farris's wife, Joyce, for her input. We are honored to have Joyce, their daughter, Monica, and son, Scott, and their families with us tonight. And I think many of you know they came from very long distances, not from Fremont or somewhere like that, from France and Florida. I'm sure many of you knew Farris from his involvement in our community. I first met Farris as a member of Sunrise Kiwanis Club in 1988, 30 years ago. He was a wonderful friend and mentor, and while I'm an avid golfer, nobody knows that, and he was an avid runner, he and others, some of them are here this evening, talked me into chairing several of the Sunrise Kiwanis Greater Goldsboro road runs, his passion. Who could say no to Farris? I'm sure many of you feel the same way. Several of my good friends here tonight also helped with the road runs. Farris and I traveled the neighboring counties to Kiwanis meetings many times, especially for the pork chops at Stantonsburg, my favorite. Always lots of laughs with Farris along, and at 7 a.m. meetings 30 years ago, I was not a morning person. I had not taken that switch in life where you're more of a morning person. Farris had 34 years of perfect attendance at Sunrise Kiwanis, and that is absolutely amazing to me. He did get credit for some of those meetings we attended in the evenings, interclubs is what they're called, so he could go to Florida and France to see his family. On the back of tonight's program, you'll see many of the ways Farris worked in support of Wayne County Public Library. He served multiple terms on both the Friends of the Library Board and the Wayne County Public Library Board. Farris was instrumental in helping to establish the Wayne County Public Library Foundation in 2011, a board he faithfully served on, and we are carrying on with many of the ideas that Farris was instrumental in developing. Tonight's program, Stained Glass Windows, a Lost Art Reborn, is dedicated to the memory of Farris A. Duncan to honor his love of history, passion for learning, and his dedicated service to the library. I'd like to invite the Foundation Board member, Charlie Gaylord, to the podium for additional remarks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here tonight to say a word about my friend Farris Duncan and brother at the bar for many years. I first knew Farris from First Baptist Church, this very church that we're in tonight. His work in the church was extensive. From the start, he and Joyce were involved in many of the organizations throughout the church. Farris was asked to serve on many committees, foremost of those perhaps the diaconate, also as a trustee of the church. He served on the Finance Committee and many others, and finally he was chairman of the Stained Glass Committee, of which we're here to talk about tonight. As a congregation, we were extremely fortunate to have someone like Farris in our church. He was a very thorough individual, very smart individual, personable, and dedicated. What else could you ask for in a church member? These same qualities took Farris to the field of law, where he was a great lawyer. When Rhonda and I first came home after law school for me, Farris was an assistant district attorney at that time. Now, Matt Delbridge will tell you that Farris was tough, and he was, but he also had a compassionate side. And that compassionate side would come to bear because if you needed prosecuting, he didn't mind obliging you, and he could see to it that you got prosecuted properly. But if there was something that he could do that would give somebody, a deserving individual, an opportunity to improve his life and become a better person, he was willing to try that. He was willing to give that person a chance. And there's many a deserving individual out there today who can give their thanks to Farris Duncan for giving them another opportunity. This was the Farris Duncan I got to know as a new lawyer coming into Goldsboro at that time. Later, Farris left the DA's office and formed an association with Dortch Langston Jr. He carried his skills with him from the DA's office, but now he was on the other side. With the same passion, he would vigorously defend a deserving client. He was effective, especially with the jury, and why wouldn't he be? After all, in front of a jury, he was everything that a deserving client could ask for. He had charisma, he was intelligent, he had humor, he had the gift of articulation, and most of all, credibility. Never in my years of practicing law or my years on the bench have I ever heard anyone say anything negative about Farris Duncan, and I think that in itself is incredible. Later on, Farris went into solo practice. He specialized in civil and real property law. This type of practice showed off Farris's organization and his attention to detail. Once again, the art of compassion surfaced, for now he was representing people who were making the biggest purchase of their entire life, or he could be assisting a family through some very tough times. There are many people out there in Wayne County who will tell you that Farris was there for them when they were going through some of the toughest times of their life. Within the legal community, Farris was known as a lawyer's lawyer. Now, that's someone who may need advice, who is an attorney or who needs counseling. And whom could you go to in our district? Farris was one of the few, and Farris was one of the ones that could offer counsel to another attorney, and he is missed by many people. When First Baptist Church first decided to repair the historic stained glass windows in our church, one of the first to step up was Farris Duncan. A most worthy project. Farris's credibility and involvement make it even more urgent that we see this project to fruition. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Okay, our presenter this evening our presenter, Dr. Fischer's academic focus is on medieval images and objects in the architecture and spatial context. Her interest in medievalism includes the study of how people in later periods and in contemporary world understand, appreciate, and recreate medieval objects. For context, Farris Duncan is mentioned. His family attended the church, First Baptist Church, and as Charlie mentioned, he was the chairman of restoring the original stained glass windows that date back to 1912, when this brick church was built. So when we were planning the dedication, we thought this would be a fitting program to provide a different and unique perspective of the windows. Dr. Fischer's research has included work on stained glass, on how stained glass is valued and appreciated, as well as college Gothic architecture, Celtic art, and manuscripts. Previous work on the local history projects include a study of Portland, Oregon's cast iron facades, many of which were built in the early 20th century to mimic stone carving of medieval structures. Please welcome Dr. Beth Fischer.
To start off, I want to say that tonight we are here thinking about the history of a church. We're thinking about something that happened 100 years ago, mostly. But the people who sat in this church in December of 1912 were not thinking about oh, this is a historic place. This was a place of the moment. This was a place that was bringing the past and the future together. Anytime you sit down and make a new church, you are thinking about what it will mean for your future congregation. So I'm asking you tonight to think about what did it mean for them to be looking forward at what they thought their church was going to be, at what they thought Goldsboro was going to be, and at what they thought the world was going to be. These windows are a critical part of that. I want to talk a little bit about the position of windows and stained glass within buildings at this time. Then I'm going to talk a lot about the details of these three windows, primarily because they're the most visible to you here. I'll talk some about the windows in the back, and I'm also happy to answer individual questions about those later. But I want to focus on things you can all see. So first off, thinking of stained glass windows, we can't think of them as paintings that are just put on a wall. They were a fundamental part of the church structure, so much so that they were often a part of the architectural arrangement. We know, for example, that James McMichael, who was the architect of this church, was frequently given credit for stained glass windows in other churches. I have not been able to find, and I don't think Marty has been able to find, details about whether that was true in this particular case. But for example, the description of Edenton Baptist Church was written up in a local building register right around the time that it was open to the public. And they said they were getting a typically excellent McMichael structure, and that included the wonderful architecture and the nice baptistry and the stone and the art glass windows, so very much a part of the church. We also can see that there is the National Register of Historic Places, the application that one of the Presbyterian churches in Charlotte submitted also credited him with the windows. So there's at least a chance that the same person who is building this space is also thinking about the windows. And that would have been encouraged at the time. There's a glass company catalog from 1914, and they have a description of their ecclesiastical stained glass. And what they say in that, and I'm going to grab this from the podium because I think it's instrumental. They say, a stained glass window is not an easel picture, to be isolated in its own frame from objects surrounding it. It should be part of the decorative scheme of the building in which it is placed. Hence, our workers are accustomed to seek the sympathetic and suggestive cooperation of the architect. So that means we need to think of these windows not as individual objects, but as ones where their placement within the space matters and their placement relative to each other. So with that in mind, let's take a look at these ones over here. Get where you're not craning your neck too much. I'll try and stand sort of here where you can go back and forth easily. So when we look at these, we see something pretty familiar. Most of us have seen images of Christ the Good Shepherd, as we see in the middle, a lot of times before. On the left side, we have Mary Magdalene, recognizing Christ after the resurrection. And over here on the right, we have John the Baptist baptizing Jesus in the Jordan. Right? So familiar types of subjects. But they weren't always so familiar. And in particular, Christ the Good Shepherd completely disappears from the pictorial record for well over 1,000 years. This picture type is extremely popular from about the year 300 to about the year 500, maybe a little later, and then it goes away. And we don't see any medieval pictures of Christ the Good Shepherd, and we don't see any Renaissance pictures of Christ the Good Shepherd. Just was not of interest to people. And then it reappears in the 19th century and gets immensely popular, mostly toward the end. So this was a fairly new focus for a stained glass window. There were not a whole lot of stained glass windows that showed this, because the period when we had stained glass is not the period when we had Christ the Good Shepherd. Now, why did they do this? Why would you pick that as a subject? What this does is it brings the focus to an approachable sort of figure. This is not Christ the King, this is Christ the Shepherd. And this is where we want to start thinking about where is this placed within the church. How many of you knew this church before the 1960 renovations? Anyone here? Couple of hands. I'd be really excited to talk to you afterward to find out about that. Based on what we've been able to figure out from looking at pictures, the orientation was totally different. So the space you're in now was still a sanctuary, This space over here was a secondary auditorium, and the pulpit was over to the side. And this was quite common for churches of the time, to have it on a slightly different axis with the pews arranged around it. What that means is that the pastor at the pulpit would have been directly facing that image, right? It wouldn't have been over to one side the way it is now. And if you're the pastor and you're looking at that picture, this is a really good example of pastoral care. This is, in fact, the ideal that you have for being a pastor, but also for being a good Christian. Now, it's a nice narrative scene of the pastor caring for his flock, of the shepherd, right? But it goes further than that. If you look at our sheep here, you see that he's carrying a lamb, but he also has 4 sheep next to him. When we see that version of Christ the Good Shepherd, we're talking about the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? So we see him surrounded by these elements that refer back to the writings. Again, if you're a good shepherd, what are you using as your support for teaching? Right? You're using the Bible, and particularly the gospel writings. So we get that message sort of encoded in here. And then we get to more symbols too. I don't know how many of you have noticed that we have 2 different types of trees here when we start looking at the scenery. On the left, we have something that has broad leaves, right? What we would expect to see on a deciduous tree. On the right, we have palm trees. Now, when we look at the art of the early 20th century and late 19th century, what we find is that usually that is a way of referencing the whole world, right? The entire expanse of the earth. Tropical, not tropical. And we have them on one side and the other, joined together. So this isn't just an image of a paradise, a nice place, an Eden, but of the world, the earth as paradise. Now again, I mentioned that this was a new kind of image at this period. And what we see is that a lot of the images of the late 19th and early 20th century look back. They go back to the roots of early Christianity to find images, and I'll point that out a couple times through the evening. This is a period when archaeology really takes off, so excavations in Egypt, but also in the Holy Land. And a lot of Baptist groups are very closely involved in trying to find out more about the history of early Christianity. So we see this effort to revive old imagery as well as dig up old stuff, as we might say. Now, I don't want to spend too long on that window because we have a lot of other stuff to talk about, but I'll be coming back to talk about all 3 of these together. I want to turn your attention to the very back of the room, to the Mary Magdalene window. I know those of you who are sitting up here are going to find it a little difficult to see from where you are. So I'll do a quick description. What we have is Jesus standing, and he's standing in front of Mary Magdalene, who is kneeling on the ground in front of him. Now, this is a popular scene. This is the moment at which the resurrected Christ is recognized. And we see the way that they're both sort of startled by this moment, or particularly that she is. What makes this particularly interesting in this context is the position of the people. So if you look at it, and particularly those of you who are right below it will notice this. Normally we would have both of these figures standing. She might be startled back, but we would have them roughly across from each other. When we place her lower down like this, and when that window is above us, his gesture encompasses those of us below it. So what you get is sort of Jesus up high, then Mary Magdalene a little lower, and then us a little lower. Now, that's not meant to be hierarchical exactly, but it's a good way of allowing him to be unobstructed and to see us. So we have that moment of recognition too. This allows us to participate in that moment and to have that kind of same connection. If you look at the colors of the window, you'll notice that the lightest spot, the place where there is the least amount of color in the sky, is right between their hands. And we're getting that moment where they come together. Looking at the other side here, where we have the baptism of Jesus by John, we get something a little bit different. So obviously, this scene of baptism is critical for Baptist theology. We have an adult being fully immersed in the Jordan River. Now, the original baptismal area in this church was behind the pulpit, so it was over here and could be opened up. What that means is that this is probably the only window, and again, this is where I'd love to talk to some of you who were here at earlier stages, but this was probably the only window that would have been visible from that space. So you have an example of baptism going on across from where baptism was actually done. Do we see how that sort of creates this connection here? So once again, we have an example being enacted. Right? We have preaching, we have recognition, we have baptism. All of these things are very important parts of the practices that were held here. So instead of having the kind of scenes where you focus a lot on hierarchy, on Christ the King, things like that, you end up with a focus on these different elements of service that are a part of the Baptist faith. Thinking of all three of these together, you get something even better. Normally, when you have Christ flanked by two figures, a man and a woman, it's Christ on the cross flanked by the Virgin Mary and John, the beloved disciple. We've probably all seen this image. It's very popular, especially in Renaissance images. So if you've ever looked at an Italian painting, you've seen this type of thing. Instead here, we get Christ the Good Shepherd flanked by a different Mary and a different John. Right? So we're changing this paradigm and putting different people there. When we think about that, of this as a rejection of that imagery and replacing it with something else, we get an image that's about salvation and about redemption rather than about sorrow. So we're not talking about the cross, we're talking about the Good Shepherd. Right? We're talking about a return to an Edenic state, we're talking about teaching the faith. So we get a totally different approach. Now, I've mostly talked about the way that these act as images, as scenes that are here. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what these are like as glass. The reason that we decided on the title of A Lost Art Reborn for this talk tonight is because stained glass in 1912 was a new technology. Now, what do I mean by that? We have stained glass windows for a long time, but these windows show you a lot of new things that had only just become possible. And so in 1920, Helen McCoy, who was an art critic, said that these churches were developing this kind of stained glass and that this was the Lost Art Reborn because they had taken the ideals of medieval stained glass, of light as a way of connecting with the divine, but new technology had made it so they could actually achieve it in a way that hadn't been possible before. Why was this newly possible? So what you're doing when you make stained glass is you're playing with the balance of color and detail versus light. You want to let as much light in as you can, but at the same time, every time you add color and detail, you're taking light away. You can see this particularly well over here, right in this area near the bottom, how dark the ground area gets because we have a lot of pigment in there. But you can also, those of you who are right here can see it in the sheep, where they've painted in a lot of lovely detail. Every hair on those sheep is painted, but that means that the light can't come through. So what we end up with is a competition between detail and light. At least that was traditionally what had happened. What they start doing is finding other ways to put the detail into the glass itself. So one of the biggest things that happens is what they call opalescent stained glass. And you can see that, those of you who are far away can certainly see it very well here on the columns up the sides, also down here. What opalescent glass let you do is take one piece of glass and get this glowing effect. You can see how bright it is compared to other things on here with these shimmering blues and pinks. This was used a lot in the late 19th century for things like plates and pitchers and bowls. And if you have a lot of old glassware, you might have a piece of this at home yourself. It took a while for them to figure out how to apply it to stained glass because it needs to be a lot stronger to be used as a building tool. So that's one thing they do that's new, that was only made possible by some of the chemical experiments in the late 19th century. Another thing they do is they start layering glass. If anyone here has mixed paint together, trying to get a certain color and been very disappointed when it turned brown, you know what sometimes happens when you mix colors together. It doesn't always come out the way you expect it to. And that's what happened with a lot of glass. You're playing with chemicals when you play with making stained glass. And often they would set up reactions that you didn't want, and you just couldn't get certain colors. Particularly things that were in the purpley shades were very hard to get. So new chemicals became available, new synthetic dyes became available, and a technique called plating became more used. What you would do to do a plated glass, let me see if I can find a good example of that here. Right here, these centers on these red centers right here on the edge, those are plated. And what you would do is you would pour a sheet of glass in one color, and then you would pour another sheet of glass in another color over it. So that you end up with two layers that are each a different color but fused together. And that lets you get colors that wouldn't have been possible before. The final thing they do, and this is one that you really are going to have to get close for, but I'll point it out in a couple of different locations and you can look later, is molded glass. So when you take glass and you make parts of it thicker and other parts of it thinner, you can get shadows and depth that you couldn't get before without painting in lines. And remember, if you paint on the lines, you're going to prevent light from going through entirely. So what they've done, for example, in the robe right here, if you come up close, you can see that this isn't flat. It has this sort of shape going on to the glass itself. They've molded it and then used it to do that. So it's different depths. And that gets you these gorgeous rippling light effects. You can see it even at a distance in the robe over here. Notice that there are a lot of places where his robe changes shades of white where there's not leading. And that's because essentially what we're doing is treating stained glass as though it's a relief sculpture. So that's a big change that happens right at this moment. And I'll try and point out some other examples of these as we go through, but this is something where I really recommend that you come look close up because it's one of those things that's so amazing once you look at about this angle and you can see it. But you can see its effects from all the way across the room. You can see the way that that lets you get these brilliant lights through the room, especially this time of day. It looks just stunning without darkening it. So again, so this is letting you have more of a painterly effect while still having the brilliance of glass. And that was one of the biggest things they wanted to do at this moment. Now, when we think about what this room was intended for, it was intended for use for the congregation, but it was also in use for things like the Baptist Convention. And in fact, that was why they were in such a hurry to get this space done. The windows would have been a critical part of that, and we know that in part because they went over budget. I was reading in a building trade magazine from 1911 that this building was supposed to cost $33,000. I know from some of the other records we have that it cost at least $44,000 with the basement unfinished. Now, they decided to keep going. The windows would have been among the last expenses used on the building. You have to put them in near the end, and the building needs to be close to done. So what that means is that the windows were a critical part of going over budget, and they chose to do them anyway. That isn't necessary. The First Baptist Church over in Richmond, which was built around the same time, decided as they went over budget that they would put in plain glass for the first 10 years and then raise the money to replace it with stained glass. So to me, what that says was that this was essential for finishing this church, for making this church the kind of place where you would hold the state convention, for making it appropriate for Goldsboro at this moment when it is a new star on the North Carolinian scene. So I don't want to spend the whole evening talking about these three, but I want to say a couple more things about how you structure stained glass. We talk a lot about color when we talk about stained glass, but we don't talk quite as much about line. And anytime you're bringing together pieces of glass like this, you have to think about the outlines. This is an art of lines and outlines as much as it is about color. So when you look at these images, try and sort of cut out the color for a second or two and look just at the outlines. A place I want to point that out to you in particular is over here on the John window. So you're making a large window. It needs to be structurally sound. That means you need to select where you're going to put the bars across the seam. You have a couple of different kinds. You have support rods. Those are these horizontal lines that go all the way across. You can particularly see them on the center window. So you need to be careful to place those where they're not going to go across someone's face or across someone's hands. So you can see that here, we've placed it just below the edges of our figures. And over here, we couldn't it wouldn't be structurally sound to place it completely below Jesus' form. We can place it right above the head of the sheep and right below his hands. Then we have the leading, and the leading is a lot more complicated because that's part of the glass itself, and that's what I'm talking about with outlines. When you're making these windows, you can't have pieces of glass that are too big or they will buckle under things like thunderstorms. So you need to break them up. And of course, anytime you change color, you need to break them up. But there's an artistry to that. You'll notice they're not all the same size. They're not even close to the same size. And that means that we can use those as part of the design. And the reason I want you to pay attention to this window is I want you to look at that line that comes from the top of John's finger. Right? That is a use of leading as an artistic element. Right? That is there to show you this connection pointing straight up to the dove that you might not otherwise really notice very much. So we're getting Holy Spirit coming down through that lead line to John's fingers. And if you look at John's finger, it's coming just slightly forward. Right? So this is a way that you can use the leading to help you sell your scene. Right? There are going to be places where you're going to have to hide it just for structural reasons, but as much as possible, you want that to help you focus the scene and tell a better story. I often have a lot of questions about what does it mean when we talk about the leading of windows, so just very quickly, when you're making stained glass, you cut out your pieces of glass from flat sheets, and then you attach them to each other by taking pieces of a lead alloy that are shaped like an H on its side. So you sort of have one set of grooves going this way and one set going this way on an attached piece. And you put a piece of glass into that groove and then you solder it down. And that's how you attach the leads. And then you have to solder them at the points where they meet. That means you can't have any lines that just end, and all of your lines have to be at an angle that you can solder them at. Those of you who have experience with things like joining and woodworking will have had some experience with this kind of idea. Curves are really hard to do. You'll notice there are a lot of curves here. Straight lines are much easier, but even then you don't want to have too many sharp corners because they're likely to fracture. So with that in mind, I want to think a little bit about the windows at the back as well. And I'm going to bring this sort of together. You don't have to face the back the whole time, but do turn around for long enough to get a good glimpse of what we've got going on here. All of the windows in this space are memorial windows. Each of them is dedicated to a person, but I want to bring your attention to these back ones because it's a little easier to see what we mean by a memorial window when we're talking about them. There are some themes that these windows have in common. When we're talking about the windows over here, we're talking about narrative imagery. It mostly tells a story. As I said, it has a lot of symbolic elements to it, but then back here we get something that focuses on the symbols. And just to give you one example of how that works, take a look at all of those lilies. And don't sit here and do this, but start thinking about how many lilies are there. And all of us will probably start by counting the ones that are really obvious, that look like a pictorial representation of a lily. A white flower, green stems. But then you start looking a little closer, and oh hey, look at those fleur-de-lis, right? There are more of those, so more lilies. And then look at the tops of the columns on the edges of the frames. Those capitals at the tops of each column, those are also lilies. And then over here on the right, look at the cross. You've got what's called a budded cross, and what that means is that the end edges of the cross are bursting into flower, probably in this case also meant to represent lilies, very similar to fleur-de-lis. So you get this layering of symbols. What does that do? Well, as you go through those, that makes you think of the symbolic aspects of lilies in different ways. So what can a lily represent? Well, if you consult a book, it'll tell you a whole long list of everything from purity to honor to, generally abundance, things like that. When you get this sort of layered symbolism, your mind sees a different aspect of it each time. Right? So when you see the white flowers, you might think more about something like the purity side or being without sin. But when you see it on the ends of the cross, you're going to think more about life after death, about this way that the dead space of the cross turns into a flowering space and comes back to life. Right? So you get that layering of symbols. The same thing happens with the other types of images. We have an open book, right? Most of us, when we see a book like that in a church, think of the Bible. In this case, especially in a window that's dedicated to someone, it also refers to the book of life. Right? So again, this hope for resurrection. Anchor, also connected with hope. So we get these messages that are repeated again and again and again. Out in the narthexes, you'll see that there are more of these memorial windows. Again, I'm going to try and keep this part brief because you can't actually see them. But you'll notice if you go out there that we have a repetition of the same type of imagery. We have other images like sheaves of wheat and grapes. Again, we get this layered type of thing, right? So that can refer to abundance. Most of you will probably also recognize that it refers to communion. When we put that in connection with a memorial window, we might remember that part of communion is about the memorial aspect of do this in remembrance of me, right? So we get these layered kinds of symbols that work together when you have them all juxtaposed and above the name of someone. In this space, though, we want to think about this as a unique group of people who are making this at a moment in time. And they are remembering their first 50 to 60 years of being a church community when they build this space. And a lot of the people who are commemorated in these windows were not just members of the community, but members of the community who embodied its values in ways that were very important to the community that continued to be there. I'm going to direct you at this point to Marty's panels in the reception hall that you should all look at afterwards that give you the details of all the people who are commemorated here. So I won't refer to all of them. But we have a leader of the Sunday school, the first person who is ordained from this church, several people who are related to the families that were pastors here. We have people who were involved in other roles where they were instrumental in furthering the service of the church through prayer, through education, and through sustaining the church as a community. The two windows that are in the narthex on this side when you first come in, oh, excellent, thank you. That's perfect. Are dedicated to the Philothea and Baraka societies. This was an organization that was created in about 1890 in Syracuse, up in New York, that was devoted to having young people learn how to apply the Bible in their daily lives. So it was all about taking something that you read and turning it into action. This should be starting to sound a little familiar by now, because what we've been seeing is the way that ideals could be used as models for action by the community here. So each of those groups, which were newly established here, they were established in 1909, I think is the earliest record, donated a window. So we have a different kind of commemoration going on with those. Those are not memorials of people. And one of them does have a memorial plaque attached to it now, but that was added in 1960 when it was moved from another window. So that aside, this is a different kind of commemoration. We move from the commemoration of the individual to the commemoration of a group activity. But it's continuing the same theme, this idea of individual members of the community who are performing services for the church. Now, let's start thinking about where they are. Especially over here, we have our memorial plaques placed below the images. That's traditional, makes it easy to read. There's a very practical purpose, but it does something else symbolically. What it does is it keeps those people as part of the congregation. It places them down here with us, among us, surrounding us. They become part of the fabric of the church. We get this integration between the church's building and the church as its members, working together. So that's something that very much happens through these windows. And that goes back to this idea that I said at the beginning, that a church is about building what they had for the past and projecting into this ideal for the future. So I want to point out just a couple last details as we're thinking about this space as a unified area. First, look at the architecture. This is a Gothic revival space. We have a lot of pointed arches. Those of you who have studied the Gothic will know that that's one of the hallmarks. Notice how the windows repeat that kind of idea. First in the wood, and then in the images. Right? We get this repetition of the arch within it with slight variations. So again, we have this idea of going from the architecture to the image in a continuous moment that makes the windows part of the church. But what that does too is it brings the outside in. We get this sense, right, particularly over here, that we're looking out the window and seeing the scene going on in the space around us. So that brings us back to here. Remember that this space originally would have looked a lot different. So I've talked about the way that it was structured differently, that we had the pulpit over here with the baptistry behind it. There was also a sort of balcony type layer that I have not been able to find pictures of. And the ceiling was painted, as well as some of the area of the pulpit, with gold flowering vines. I'd love, again, if anyone knows what that looked like, I would love to hear about it in more detail. But from looking at pictures of similar types of church decoration from the same period, that would have created a juxtaposition between the edges of these images, particularly these one back here, and the interior of the space. This very unified approach in which the windows become a part of the fabric of the church. So picture this space with electric lights that are not quite as strong as they are now, a little dimmer, placed a little differently, along with the changing light that comes through the course of the day. And imagine it with gold-painted ceilings, and the way that that would have caught the light. And then think about what I said about the technology of these windows, about the way that the opalescent glass, right, this very flickering quality of glass that you get, would have affected the light. You end up with a space that feels more alive than it would without these windows. So we have the message in the windows, and we have the message that's created by the way that the windows work as objects that change this space. And those things came together. And I think the big thing to remember is that the congregation that built this church was hoping that those windows would continue to make people feel something years and years and years later. They built them to evoke feelings, and that was their hope for the future. And I think that looking around here, I think they would probably feel like that had been very successful. And I encourage you all to take a closer look at these windows and tell me what you think about them. I'd love to hear some of your stories as we talk further. Thank you.